Hiya, Kenton here again. I've just painted this little scene of Simonside with some cornfields in the foreground. If it's the first time you've found this channel, welcome along. If you've been before, welcome back. So if you want to see how I made this painting, stick around. I'll show you the techniques that I've used to create this. Hi, it's voiceover Kenton here again. And this is going to be not such a speeded up process, but it's going to be a complete walkthrough of how I create this painting of the Simonside Hills with a nice cornfield in the foreground. As you can see there, I'm just starting off with some little thumbnail sketches just to sort of get an idea of the colours that I want to use. I was wanting to put a nice oak tree in the kind of middle distance, so I was just kind of warming up with that as well. As it's a watercolour, I'm going to go over with just a very light pencil sketch over the paper. I've gone for a kind of panoramic view of this one, like letterbox style. This is a scene that I've painted quite a few times, and it's always a popular scene. I think a lot of people sort of identify with it. So, but this time I wanted to go for a nice sort of wide landscape. So I've started off by applying just some clean water as a wash to the background paper. This is a cold pressed 300 gram paper. And then on top of that, I've put some French ultramarine with a little bit of light red just to grade off a little bit. And then just letting that blend into the paper in the background. And then just some yellow ochre into the bottom half of the horizon. One of the things that you'll notice with atmospheric light changes is you often get this kind of creamy haze to the sky just above the horizon. So skies are not always the blue that you think they are. If you actually spend a bit of time watching them and painting them, then you'll find that you often see this. In fact, sometimes I even like to just change things up a little bit and put the whole sky in with this kind of yellow ochre, because if you were zooming in on an area, then that is something that you would find. Once the sky's in, then I'm using a slightly darker mix of the French ultramarine and a little bit of the light red just to grey that off a little bit, and then putting in that distant shape there. I'm using a round brush with a nice sort of tapered top. Speeded the process up with a hairdryer. Then I'm putting in a yellow ochre colour just for the field here. Each time I'm passing over that, I'm going back into the pan of colour just to darken that down, just to create a bit more saturation. And then using a kind of yellowy blue mix just to create some lines into the field, just to sort of create some lines of perspective. The next technique I'm using here is using some salt, some crushed salt, onto the wet mix. That just sucks up the paint. The paint's attracted to the salt, and then it leaves these nice little shapes at the end. So I leave those on the paper while that dries. And then while that's drying, I don't need to dry that off. In fact, it's best not to speed up the process of that drying too much, because the paint is very wet at the bottom there and you can start blowing the paint around. So just leave that to dry, and then I work in with a darker bluey grey sort of mix, putting in these middle ground trees. So this brush is absolutely perfect for this. It just gives a nice loose feel, and I can get some quite nice fine lines, but I don't want to overwork the detail too much. Then when the first mix is in, I'm adding some lemon yellow just to the left hand side. So I'm imagining that the light is coming from the left hand side here, and that bleeds into the wet paint that I've just put in and fills out that space and pushes the darker paint just to the side, so it gives a bit of colour to it, but with the shade, and it gives a lot of variation to it. Now that the foreground is all dry, I want to put a bit extra texture in on top of this, the salt technique. So I'm just using a bit of raw umber and a flat old brush just to flick some of that paint in. And because I've wet the yellow ochre field first, that just helps to blend that in a little bit, so it's a nice soft blend. And if it's a little bit too heavy, then I'm obviously taking that out a little bit with a clean kitchen towel. As you saw right at the very beginning, I did a little practice run with a tree. So again, I'm using this nice round brush here, just dotting the foliage in. This is a subject that I've done many times, and I've painted this shape of tree many times, so it's all just from memory. And I've gone for a blue and yellow mix just to get the green, so I haven't used a pre-mixed green. Similar to what I was doing with the middle ground trees, when I'm just adding a little bit of Payne's grey just to the bottom right hand side of the tree, just to create the effect of shadow. And then for the light hitting the top of the branches, the top foliage, I'm just going straight in there with some of the lemon yellow, so that gives that nice effect. So you've got the light hitting on the left hand side, and then you've got the shadow in the background. Depends what I've got to hand. Sometimes I use a knife or the back end of a brush. On this occasion, I'm using my ink dip pen, which has obviously got no ink in it, but I'm just using that just to pull down some of the paint, just to give the effect of the branches in between the gaps in the foliage. A nice little thing I like to do is apply some of the paint as if it were inked directly into the nib of the dip pen, and then I can actually just use that to draw some fine details on. A few birds go in using that technique. I need to rub off all of the salt that is now dried on that painting. I did make sure that was fully dried, otherwise you're going to smear things. And then some of that bluey green mix just for the grasses and the foliage at the front there. And it's just a case of, I'm not mixing up a huge amount, I'm just dipping my brush into the back of the nib and filling up the nib with ink. And that completes the painting. I've signed it there on the right hand side, and then the masking tape that I've put on held everything in place. I didn't stretch the paper and pre-wet it. It wasn't necessary to do that, but the unveil with the masking tape keeps all the paint contained and gives you a nice presented piece. So whether that's going to be framed or sold as an unframed piece, you've got a number of options with that. Thanks for watching that to the end. Hopefully you enjoyed that process, and you can obviously always subscribe to this channel and see more paintings. Sometimes I paint in the studio here, or sometimes I go out and around and do sketches, always around Northumberland. Anyway, thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time. Thanks, bye-bye.